They called it a routine oversight hearing, just another day on Capitol Hill. But the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped into that marble-lined chamber, it stopped feeling routine. The air had a thickness to it, the kind that makes your skin prickle even if you don't know why. At the witness table, Justice Sonia Sotomayor sat in a dark suit that looked calm, respectable, untouchable. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Decades on the bench had taught her the power of appearing unshakable. But Jasmine wasn't here to be impressed. She'd come armed with a stack of records so heavy her staffer carried them like a weapon, transcripts, financial disclosures, public statements, all marked up in neon tabs. Evidence. Cameras were already rolling. Aide after aide lined the walls, eyes darting between the Congresswoman and the Supreme Court Justice like they were watching a fuse burn toward dynamite. The committee chair tried to start with pleasantries. "Thank you for your service, Your Honor," but nobody in the room really cared. Not today. Because all over America, people were tired of polite ceremonies that protected the powerful from accountability. And Jasmine? She was about to say what everyone else only whispered. She adjusted her mic, her hand steady. Her voice, when it came, was low but clear, like a warning. "Justice Sotomayor," she began, eyes locked on the older woman across from her, "I've read your rulings. I've studied your speeches. And I have to ask, when did the bench stop being about the people and start being about preserving the institution itself?" A hush fell over the chamber. No one expected her to open with that. And Jasmine wasn't done. Justice Sotomayor lifted her chin, her expression unreadable, calm on the surface, but a flicker of something behind her eyes. Surprise? Annoyance? Jasmine couldn't be sure. "Congresswoman," the justice replied evenly, "the integrity of this court is paramount. It is the backbone of public trust in our democracy." Jasmine didn't blink. She knew that line by heart. She'd heard it rehearsed by judges, senators, bureaucrats, people who could recite it in their sleep. She leaned in a fraction closer, her voice tightening just enough to cut through the stillness. "And what happens," she asked, "when the public stops believing it?" That question hung in the air like a live wire. Sotomayor folded her hands. "Public trust is earned over time. Through consistent adherence to principle." "Principle," Jasmine repeated softly. Then she pulled out the first of her documents, holding it up so everyone in the room, and every reporter watching, could see the seal of the United States Supreme Court. "This," she said, tapping the page, "is your concurring opinion in Daniels v. Feldman, where you argued that the court must avoid even the appearance of political bias." Sotomayor's jaw tightened, just enough to notice. Jasmine flipped to another tab. "And this," she continued, "is a transcript of a private event you attended last year. Closed to the press. Hosted by a political action committee. Where, by your own words, you praised donors for helping shape the environment that protects judicial independence." A murmur rippled across the back of the chamber. Someone gasped. Someone else started typing furiously. Sotomayor drew in a slow, deliberate breath. "Those remarks were about civic engagement," she said, her tone still composed. Jasmine didn't move. "Words matter. So does timing. So does who's in the room when you say them." For the first time, the justice shifted in her seat. It was subtle, but Jasmine saw it. That moment when certainty turns into calculation. And she knew right then, she wasn't here to play a part. She was here to pull back the curtain. Jasmine didn't look away. She let the quiet spread, let it wrap around every person in the chamber until it became something dense, inescapable. "Justice Sotomayor," she said, voice even but edged with something harder, "you've built your career on the idea that justice must not only be done, but be seen to be done." Sotomayor nodded once, cautious. "So tell me," Jasmine went on, "how does it look to the public when one of the highest judges in the nation attends private donor events behind closed doors?" How does it look to the single mother in Detroit who can't afford an attorney? Or the veteran in rural Tennessee who's waited 2 years for an appeal? The camera zoomed in, catching the strain around Sotomayor's eyes. It looks, Jasmine said, lowering her voice to a near whisper, like there's one standard for the powerful and another for everybody else. Sotomayor opened her mouth, but Jasmine raised a hand, stopping her. Not out of disrespect, out of certainty. I'm not here to smear your name, she said, her tone softening just enough to feel human. I'm here because I've seen too many people give up on this system, on you, because it feels rigged. And I refuse to pretend that isn't happening. For a heartbeat, the justice didn't answer. The reporters shifted in their seats. One of Sotomayor's aides scribbled notes with a hand that trembled. And then Jasmine dropped the last piece of paper onto the table. This, she said, tapping it once, is a list of cases your court declined to hear. Cases involving voting rights, eviction appeals, disability claims. You said no explanation was necessary. But to the people whose lives depend on those decisions, silence is an answer. Her voice sharpened. And it's not the answer they deserve. You could hear nothing in that room but the quiet scratch of a pen and the faint hum of the cameras capturing every second. Sotomayor drew a slow breath, her composure returning like a practiced reflex. Congresswoman Crockett, she began, I understand your concern. But. Jasmine didn't wait for the but. Do you? She asked, her voice calm and devastating all at once. Do you really? Because in that moment, the question didn't feel rhetorical. It felt like a mirror. And nobody in that room, not even a Supreme Court justice, could look away. The hush that followed was thick enough to taste. Jasmine didn't look down at her notes. She didn't need to. I spent 10 years as a public defender, she said, her voice steady, almost gentle. I watched judges walk into courtrooms and never once look into the eyes of the people they were sentencing. Not because they were cruel, because they were insulated. Sotomayor's gaze flickered, just for a heartbeat. Jasmine caught it. And that insulation, Jasmine continued, is a luxury. One the rest of us can't afford. A ripple of movement, staffers shifting uncomfortably, a photographer lowering her camera as if to respect the gravity of what was happening. I don't question your intellect, Jasmine said, leaning forward just enough to close the space between them. Or your career. Or your legacy. But I do question your priorities. Sotomayor tried to reassert her authority, her voice was calm, deliberate, almost maternal. Congresswoman Crockett, the judiciary must maintain impartiality. We cannot. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You can't pretend impartiality, she said softly, when the house is burning and you're the only one holding the hose. For a moment, the Chief Justice herself could have walked in, and no one would have looked away from Jasmine. Let me ask you this, Jasmine said, and she held up a photograph. A young woman in a wheelchair, her hands folded in her lap. Do you remember this name? Maria Gonzalez. She filed a petition to be heard by your court after her Medicaid was cut off. She died before you ruled. A low murmur. Sotomayor's expression faltered, only for a second. I know you can't save everyone, Jasmine said, her voice dropping to something that sounded heartbreakingly human. But you could have saved her. The silence wasn't just tense anymore, it was shattering. And before you tell me again that your hands are tied, Jasmine said, her eyes locked on Sotomayor's, remember that the ropes you feel around your wrists look like lifelines to the people you won't reach for. In that instant, Jasmine didn't look like a politician. She looked like something older, something relentless. A witness. A reckoning. And everyone in that room knew it. For a few endless seconds, nobody moved. No one coughed, no one shifted papers to break the weight of Jasmine's words. Judge Sotomayor pressed her lips together. She looked like she wanted to say something, anything, that could soften the moment, to remind everyone she was still the highest judicial authority at that table. But Jasmine had struck a place no title could shield. Slowly, Sotomayor set her pen down. The small sound of it touching the table sounded almost ceremonial. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, her voice low, "you're speaking about cases that are subject to complex constitutional constraints. It isn't as simple as—" Jasmine lifted her hand, just a breath of motion, but it was enough to make Sotomayor stop mid-sentence. "No," Jasmine said, her voice almost hushed. "It's not simple. But it is clear." Sotomayor held her gaze. A measured, judicial look. But Jasmine was past being measured. "Every time this court defers to precedent that was written by people who never imagined my constituents as equals," she continued, her tone like a blade wrapped in velvet, "you validate the idea that justice has an expiration date." Sotomayor inhaled, slow, controlled. She wasn't used to this kind of direct challenge. "And I am tired," Jasmine said, leaning forward, her palms flat on the table, "of watching respected figures like you pretend that systemic neglect is neutrality." A tremor of reaction flickered across the faces in the gallery, journalists realizing they were witnessing something no talking point could contain. "Your Honor," Jasmine said, her voice threading quiet steel into the air, "when you stand behind procedure to excuse an action, you become complicit in the very harm you claim to lament." Sotomayor didn't interrupt this time. She didn't even blink. And Jasmine wasn't finished. She lifted another file from her stack. Thick. Annotated. Its cover read simply, "Cases declined for certiorari, 2023. This," she said, tapping the folder, "is not a list of technicalities. It is a list of human beings. People whose names you'll never remember. But their families will never forget that you were too busy defending your image of impartiality to offer them a hearing." It was the kind of statement that settled over the room like a final verdict. And in that moment, it wasn't just Judge Sotomayor Jasmine was addressing. It was every institution that thought credibility was something you could declare by fiat. For a heartbeat, it felt like the hearing had stopped existing in linear time. Like the old fluorescent lights above them were flickering in and out of some parallel universe where the truth was a living thing that refused to be smothered by decorum. Judge Sotomayor adjusted her glasses. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said quietly, her tone heavier than before, "you know as well as I do that the judiciary cannot be swayed by public perception. We are bound to interpret the law, not popular sentiment." Jasmine tilted her head. The gesture looked almost polite, until she spoke. "I'm not asking you to surrender to public sentiment," she said. "I'm asking you to stop pretending that silence is an act of principle." Sotomayor pressed her lips into a thin line. "Let me be clear," Jasmine continued, her voice stronger now, carrying across the packed room, "your detachment does not protect the court's integrity. It only insulates it from accountability." Somewhere behind the cameras, a young woman whispered "damn," under her breath, too soft for the microphones to catch but loud enough that the energy in the chamber rippled. "You have written opinions," Jasmine said, holding up another document, "that use the phrase, respect for precedent, more times than I can count. And yet, when precedent itself is an instrument of injustice, you defend it as though it's sacred scripture." Sotomayor's eyes flicked down to her notes. Maybe she thought Jasmine would stop there. She didn't. "My father," Jasmine said, her voice dipping softer, almost conversational, "used to tell me that if a system can't be questioned, it's not a system, it's a racket." The room shifted, as though everyone collectively took one shallow breath. "You have the power," Jasmine said, voice tightening, "to give people the dignity of a hearing. To give them the sense that their government remembers they exist. And instead, you hide behind the sanctity of tradition." Sotomayor opened her mouth, then closed it. Jasmine set down the folder and clasped her hands. "I didn't come here to play to the cameras," she said. "I came here to remind you that the Supreme Court is not beyond reproach simply because it wears the illusion of impartiality. She paused, her gaze steady. Sometimes, your restraint isn't wisdom. It's cowardice in a black robe. Silence. The kind of silence that feels like the air itself is waiting to see who will dare speak next. It was the quietest the hearing had been all morning, until a reporter's camera clicked, as if to confirm to history that yes, someone had finally said it out loud. Judge Sotomayor inhaled slowly. When she spoke, her voice was still composed, but the practiced calm had a ragged edge to it. Congresswoman, with respect, you cannot possibly understand the burden of neutrality this court must maintain. Jasmine didn't blink. You're right, she said evenly. I can't understand neutrality that excuses harm while branding it as fairness. Her voice stayed steady, if anything, it grew more precise. I have spent my career watching people get ground up by procedures they couldn't name, Jasmine went on, tone low but relentless. And every time, the court said the same thing, that their suffering wasn't a question of principle, only process. She lifted her eyes, pinning the judge with a look that made some of the aides shift uncomfortably. When precedent becomes the shield for cruelty, Jasmine said, it's no longer precedent. It's complicity. The chairperson shifted in his seat. Congresswoman Crockett. She held up her hand. No, she said simply. Let me finish. She turned back to Sotomayor. I know what you've accomplished. I know what it means for a girl from the Bronx to sit on this bench, Jasmine said, her tone softening for just a moment. But representation without courage is just decoration. Sotomayor swallowed visibly. You have a choice, Jasmine said, voice threading steel and sorrow together. You can be remembered as the justice who told the truth about the system she helped shape, or as the one who defended its failures because she'd invested too much to admit they were failures. No one moved. Not even the stenographer. Jasmine looked down, then back up, her tone now almost quiet enough to be intimate. My constituents don't need another ceremony about fairness, she said. They need someone with power to say that sometimes, the law is wrong. Her gaze didn't waver. And if you can't say it, she concluded, then don't be surprised when the people do. The judge sat motionless, eyes locked on hers, the silence between them dense as wet cement. The pause stretched long enough for the world outside that hearing room to start paying attention. The clip hit social media within minutes, just a single shot of Jasmine leaning forward, her words almost a whisper, the caption reading. Representation without courage is just decoration. And in that sentence, the room felt smaller. Sotomayor's expression shifted, just a fraction, but Jasmine saw it, the recognition of a truth too plain to refute. Congresswoman, Sotomayor began, her voice now lower, the court cannot abandon stability every time the winds of public opinion shift. Our job, my job, is to uphold the Constitution. Jasmine nodded slowly. But whose Constitution? She asked. It wasn't a rhetorical question. It sounded almost like a lament. When you say stability, Jasmine continued, what you mean is that the people who already have power get to keep it undisturbed. Her voice rose just enough to carry to the press gallery. And I'm not here to dismantle the Constitution, she said. I'm here to remind you that the document was designed to be amended. To evolve. To recognize that law written to protect the privileged is law that will never deliver justice to the rest. Someone in the back audibly exhaled. Sotomayor folded her hands, but she didn't look away. Congresswoman Crockett, she said carefully, if you think this court has abandoned its mission, then perhaps it is Congress's duty to propose reforms. Jasmine inclined her head. Don't tempt me, she replied, with a flicker of something dangerously close to a smile. Then she sobered again. I didn't come here to lecture you, she said. I came here because the people I represent deserve to know that when they walk into a courtroom, they are not invisible. Her tone turned quiet again. That their pain isn't just a footnote to be weighed against the comfort of precedent. The hush in the chamber was total. And for just a heartbeat, Sotomayor didn't look like a Supreme Court justice. She looked like a woman carrying more years of compromise than anyone should have to shoulder. Jasmine let the silence hold. "History will decide which one of us was right," she said. Sotomayor exhaled, her shoulders dropping an inch. "It always does," the justice murmured. The cameras didn't catch the next part clearly. They were too busy panning across the committee table, trying to capture reactions, searching for another face to interpret the moment. But in that low, untelevised hush, Jasmine and Sotomayor just watched each other, two women from different worlds, bound together for a sliver of history by the audacity of telling the truth out loud. Jasmine shifted her notes aside and spoke again, this time without reading. "You know," she said softly, "when I was a public defender, I used to stand next to clients who were guilty of everything they were accused of. And still, I had to fight like they were innocent. Because that was my job." Sotomayor studied her, not interrupting. "I think," Jasmine went on, "it's easy to forget that the law doesn't care if you're tired. It doesn't care if you've been doing this for decades. It doesn't care how many nights you've gone without sleep, how many times you've tried to do the right thing." Her hand touched the folder again, almost reflexively. "And it definitely doesn't care about your reputation." Sotomayor swallowed, her jaw setting in a line. "But the people do," Jasmine said. She straightened her posture so she was fully facing the justice. "They care about whether you're willing to use that power for them. Even when it's inconvenient. Even when it costs you something." Her voice dropped low enough that only the first two rows could really hear. "You once said the law must never lose sight of its humanity," Jasmine said. "I've carried that quote with me for years." She paused. "I just hope you haven't stopped believing it yourself." The gallery was stone silent. No shuffling papers, no clicking cameras. Just the quiet, electric recognition that they were witnessing something rare, a conversation that wasn't about performance. Sotomayor leaned forward, her voice so quiet it was almost inaudible. "I haven't," she said. Then, slowly, Jasmine closed the folder. "In that case," she replied, "we still have something in common." The chair cleared his throat. "The committee thanks Representative Crockett for her remarks," he said, but even his voice sounded reluctant to break the spell. As the hearing recessed, reporters didn't rush out immediately. They sat there, scribbling and thinking and rewatching clips on their phones. Because some exchanges don't need a headline to be history. When the final gavel fell, and the hearing adjourned, the headlines didn't fully capture what had happened. Sure, the networks ran with the most explosive clips, Jasmine laying out the statistics, Jasmine demanding accountability, Jasmine staring down the bench, but they missed the deeper current. They missed the moment when Sotomayor looked up, eyes faintly damp, and saw her own words being handed back to her, not as praise but as a reminder. Outside, the press pool was already gathered. Someone called Jasmine's name. Another shouted a question about whether she would consider a Senate run. She didn't stop to answer. Instead, she moved through the crowd with that same measured calm she'd carried into the chamber, like she knew that the real work wasn't over, that the fight didn't end when the cameras cut. A few steps behind her, an older woman in a navy pantsuit, someone's grandmother, someone's retired teacher, caught Jasmine's sleeve. Her voice shook when she spoke. "I never thought I'd see someone say it like that," she whispered. Jasmine looked her in the eye. It needed to be said. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. Because sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to stay silent. And as she disappeared into the swirl of aides, microphones, and Capitol corridors, her words lingered, softer than outrage but heavier than any applause. And that was the point. Not to go viral. Not to collect clout. But to remind the people watching that the law is only as honest as the people brave enough to challenge it. And today, Jasmine Crockett had challenged it, calmly, deliberately, and without apology. If this story moved you, subscribe for more. Because this wasn't just a moment, it was a promise that someone, somewhere, will always stand up and say, "I see you. I hear you. And I will not let this go unanswered." This wasn't just a debate. This was a direct challenge to the comfortable silence of power. Jasmine Crockett didn't come to play it safe, she came to hold the entire system accountable. As you watched, you could feel it, this was not an ordinary moment. The cameras will turn off. The headlines will move on. But what remains is this. Courage is contagious. Speaking the truth is contagious. And when one person stands up, it gives everyone else permission to do the same. This story was a reminder. Justice doesn't live only in legal texts. Justice lives in the voices of those brave enough to defend it. If this moment made you think, inspired you, or simply reminded you of what's right, share it. Because real change begins the second someone decides not to stay silent. Today, Jasmine was that someone.